Now we've got two big topics here. First one in this video is a lecture. Second one in the next video is also a lecture, and they're both going to take up a lot of time. This video is about validation. Should we do our data validation on the client or on the server? What are the pros and cons of each? What are the best practices? Now the next video we're going to move into specifically SQL Server constraints. So let's just get started. We've got, like I said, a lot to cover here. Now let's use this scenario for the rest of this video. So keep this in your head as we're talking during this video. You and a partner have been asked to create a mission critical website for your organization. Now your partner's job is to actually do the web code. They're going to be doing it in C# or VB or whatever language you want to put it in that's not SQL. Okay? Your job is the database developer. Now, before we really jump in here, let's just get some terms together here. The front end, that's what we're going to use as the term to be the website. That's the visible application that the end user will enter their data into, click the fancy submit button, all of that, right? The back end, we're going to talk about that in this case being the things that the user doesn't see, the SQL Server, the data storage layer. Now you probably are already familiar with client server. We're going to call the website the client. The server then is going to be our SQL Server. That's the back end. And it, there's a lot of different ways we could say this. The application layer, the database layer. Just don't get bogged down into semantics if I say one versus another more often. I probably have 4 or 5 different ways of saying these because we always talk about these. Now, right now, at this point in the life cycle of your application, you and your partner are having a discussion about how the data should be validated. Now, what does that mean? The user goes to the website. They go to a registration page. Let's just use that for an example. And they click submit. How should that data be validated? Okay? So should that validation occur on the client? Should it occur on the server? Should it occur on both? What we're talking about with validation, it has to adhere to the business rules. Now your business rules can be enforced in the front end, in the back end. You can have middle tier components that do validation. We could do any combination of these. Here's an example of client-side validation. Right, we've all been to some sort of an application where we enter something in, like you see right here. We're supposed to be entering in a number, but we haven't. We've entered some textual data in here. When we or the user hits the calculate button, instead of sending that to the server, they've decided to, on the client, go ahead and let them know, hey, this is not valid. I am not sending this to the server because you don't have the right data type. Okay? That's client-side validation. Users enter it onto the form. Validation is performed by the application. If the validation fails, it does not send that request to the server. Okay? Client-side validation. Now, server-side validation, this is when your data validation is performed at the database level. Like, for example, the application sent over an insert statement that looks like this. Now, I know we haven't completely covered the insert statement yet, but you can probably figure out that hint ID is this, display text is now this, and then the date added is this. What about Movember? Is that an actual date? No, and so the server says conversion failed when converting the date. So this would be an example of server-side validation. Because it failed validation, the data was not stored, and an error message was sent back to the client. Okay? Server-side validation. Now, in a case like this is fairly basic validation. This was simply data type validation, right? We were just checking to see if this was an actual date, because that's the data type for the date added column. Now, let's say this. Your partner who's developing the website says to you, let's just do all that validation in the front end. Okay? You might also hear, but if the data is valid in the application layer, why do we have to validate it again at the database? Won't it just hurt performance? We have to perform validation twice? Or other things that you're likely to hear, why send the data to the database that we know will fail validation once it gets there? Why don't we just test everything in the front end and only pass it to the back end when we know it's valid? That way we don't have to write these validation rules twice. We don't have to put them in the front end and then put them in the back end. Now, some of you are probably nodding your head because yesterday you had this discussion. This is something that happens every single day. This happens if you're a solo developer, you've got to have that conversation with yourself. Where do we do our validation? So let's do this. Should you perform all validation only at the client level? Right? Well, actually, this is kind of a trick question. You can't do it only this way because SQL Server already is going to perform data type validation, for example, when you try to insert and update rows. Like we tried to put Movember into a date and it failed, right? Won't allow you to bypass data type validation. Won't allow you to bypass nullability if you mark a column as required and somebody tries to put in a null, for example. It won't work. It will send back an error and reject that row. So we can't do every bit of validation. That then leads us to the question, what type of validation should we perform in the client? And I thought I'd try to make this a do and don't list, and maybe this would help us think along these lines. Okay? So do. What should we use client-side validation for? Data type mismatches. Obvious case that we had that mortgage thing. If you know you're supposed to put in a number and the user doesn't put in a number, don't submit it to the server. Send an error message back to the client right then and there saying, hey, you got to get this correct before we're going to continue. Same thing with required and optional. Make them fill in the required fields on the form before you send it to the server, only to have it rejected by the server. Minimums and maximums. For example, if you know that a user's birth date, it's impossible that their birth date is in the future for your form, then you can then say, hey, the maximum allowed value for this form is 1986 or whatever. You can put in your own client-side validation for that. No sense in sending that to the server and only having it rejected. Okay? Invalid strings, for example, you know that the first name does not allow the percent sign, for example. Go ahead and block that in the front end. You don't want that garbage being sent to your database. Now, what about things that the database validation or that the server will have difficulty validating? You definitely want to do those with client-side validation. However, and I know you're going to hate me for this, I'm not going to tell you what those are just yet. We're not far enough along. We are going to talk more about that when we talk about the CLR later on in the course. Now, you're used to this client-side validation all the time, right? We use this as front-end developers when we're helping people fill out forms, making sure people use numbers in a number field. I've seen people use JavaScript to prevent anything except for a number being entered. Making sure an email address fits a certain regular expression pattern. Password strength meters, where as you start typing your password, it shows you red or green for weak or strong or whatnot. Okay? That's perfect use of client-side validation. But should you use client-side validation to enforce uniqueness on a table? No. That's what a primary key is for, right? That's a server-side validation. Now, I can hear some of the people, particularly those that are application developers now, saying, but wait a minute, it's that same thing. Why send it to the server if I know that it's not unique? Why do you know it's not unique? How many situations are you going to be in where you have a cached copy of that data in the application and you can guarantee that that cache has not changed, and the user is now trying to upload a new row. The only times that that makes sense is when you have a fairly static table. A table like a categories, for example. Categories tables are generally static. They don't get new categories very often. They might have, you'd probably have, for example, more subcategories being added than categories being added. More products being added to the subcategories that are already within a category than the category being added itself. Okay, so you have to consider here the database already has a primary key for this. Why would you want to load the entire table into the client, store it in memory there, and then perform that check against the client memory? You have no guarantee that you are the only application hooked into the database, do you? You could have somebody using your website, but another user using the SQL Server Management Studio to write insert statements. Okay? So this is probably not a good idea. Use your primary keys for enforcing uniqueness on a table. How about testing an entered row against other rows in the table or against other rows in the database, in other tables, for example? Again, this is what the database does. You send the request to the database, you let the database do those lookups and tell you if something exists, does not exist, is larger than a value. You don't suck over the entire database into the application and start then programming against it. Enforcing parent-child relationships. There are cases where you will do this in the front-end code. However, they're going to be fairly stagnant tables. You're going to have like a password hint and an application, and that's going to be you're going to create a parent-child relationship that mimics something in the database. But you're going to use, as we'll learn about in the next video, a foreign key in the server to do that at the database level. Okay? And then there's all these ideas of custom business rules that all of the data in a table has to adhere to. Okay, stay with me here because we're getting into the meat of this video. Okay, this is the real part. Everything really on this screen, we could rewrite this to say use server validation for these things, because this is all a great example of what we would use server validation for. Now, the custom business rules aspect here, what about this? Do you have any tables in your database that are only allowed to have a single row? I do. I have several metadata tables. They're configuration tables. They're only allowed to have a single row. Okay? That would be a custom business rule for that table. An email address must be a valid email. Not that the string has to perform or conform to a pattern. I mean, it's got to be a real email address. I have to be able to ping the mail server and the mail server come back and say, yes, that is a real person. That's a custom business rule. The user's state province must match the postal code that they entered. These are all custom business rules. Okay? Employees have to be at least 21 years of age. Custom business rule, right? Now, I say these things because these are all things that every row in the table must conform to. Like, let's just take these two down here. Every row that comes into the table, I don't care what the source of it is, has to conform to these business rules. Today, you're developing a website for this. But tomorrow, you might be inside of Management Studio manually entering a few records to help get it started. Don't you want those custom business rules to also apply while you're in the Management Studio? Next week, you might write an SSIS, a SQL Server Integration Services package, to load up data from a flat file. Don't you want these custom business rules to also apply? Of course you do. Okay? These custom business rules have to apply to every row in the table. Okay? Now, back to our scenario. We're designing a website, right? We're the database developer here. Your front-end developer came to you and he said, how about we put all of our business rules in the front end. We'll just put everything in the website, and that's the only place we'll do validation. Well, here's the big gotcha with that. And I promise you, if you have not been into that scenario, it's going to happen if you work with probably some of your less experienced developers out there. They make that argument. Why would I want to write this twice? Why would I want to put these same business rules in the front end that I then put in the back end? Well, here's your logic. If you put all of the custom business rule enforcement in the website code, what happens later on when that same person has to design a Windows Forms version? Now they have to duplicate that effort, right? They now have to take those business rules and put them in the Windows Forms application. Or they have to re-architect their solution. They have to say, well, now I need a middle tier component. I need to take everything out of the website, move it to the middle tier, and now I'll rewrite the website to use the middle tier, and I'll write the Windows Forms to use the middle tier as well. What it doesn't deal with is the idea that tomorrow you are in Management Studio and you try to add an employee. Is it going to reject you? No. Management Studio is not accessing the middle tier. Management Studio is not using those custom business rules that were written in .NET or whatever language. Okay? So most applications will do a mixture of different techniques. You're going to see the client-side validation being done. Don't send requests to the server that you know are going to fail for things like data type mismatches, what we covered earlier. The server-side validation, primary keys, foreign keys, all the things we'll talk about in the next video. And then the middle tier is perfect for reusable validation, specifically for things that can't easily be done by SQL Server. And we'll talk more about those when we get to CLR. Okay, I kind of feel like I led you halfway down this path, so let's come back in the next video and finish this up.